Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline and want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows, or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today, that's Linode, and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own, and don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Modern data teams are dealing with a lot of complexity in their data pipelines and analytical code. Monitoring data quality, tracing incidents, and testing changes can be daunting and often takes hours or days. Datafold helps data teams gain visibility and confidence in the quality of their analytical data through data profiling, column-level lineage, and intelligent anomaly detection. Datafold also helps automate regression testing of ETL code with its data diff feature that instantly shows how a change in ETL or BI code affects the produced data, both on a statistical level and down to individual rows and values. Datafold integrates with all major data warehouses, as well as frameworks such as Airflow and dbt, and seamlessly plugs into CI workflows. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Datafold today to start a 30-day trial of Datafold. Once you sign up and create an alert in Datafold for your company data, they'll send you a cool water flask. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Tarush Aggarwal about his mission at 5xData to teach companies how to build solid foundations for their data capabilities. So, Tarush, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you, Tobias, for having me on the show. Super excited to be here. Just a little bit of myself. I've been in the data space for the last 10 years. I started off in Silicon Valley at Salesforce.com. Back then, 10 years ago, Salesforce didn't really have a data team. So I got to be the first data engineer on the analytics team over there. That team is probably now massive. Yeah, most recently, I was at WeWork, which is a super colorful company. But we did some really cool stuff around data, and I got to scale the data team up from 2 to 100 people. So I really spent the last 10 years in data. Yeah, sort of super passionate about what's happening, and I think this is a really, really exciting time for the data space in general.
Yeah, it's definitely pretty remarkable how much the overall ecosystem has grown just in the past year or two, let alone the past decade.
Yeah. One of the things right now is just seeing what remote work is doing to, the data space. The fact that, people are not in the office, it's putting a highlight on what visibility does the company need around its systems and around its people. So I think we're one of the few industries which has been sort of positively affecting data.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time for everybody and an interesting time to be in data. And you mentioned how you first got involved in data management, but can you give a bit of an overview about what it is that you're building now at 5xData and some of the story behind your decision to go that direction?
Just a little bit of context. I left WeWork around 6 months ago. And as I was still advising a few companies on their data strategies. And what we really realized is it doesn't really matter what you're trying to do. It doesn't matter if you're a fintech company or real estate or marketing or e-commerce or a traditional SaaS company. If you're serious about scaling your business, at some point you are going to need to build a data foundation. You're going to want to have visibility into your go-to-market strategy, and more importantly, you are going to want to be able to leverage data to build products that your customers love, to discover hidden insights in your data. So, what we've seen is the only difference is when you invest in it. If you're an e-commerce business, you might go do this at 7 figures. If you're a traditional SaaS company, you might do this even pre-revenue. But what we realized is all companies need to have this foundation. And the second thing is, it's not very easy to go invest in data, right? Data hires are expensive. And more often than not, what we find is that companies rush to, gain insights from their data. So they might go hire a data scientist or a data analyst, and these folks are going to go focus on the insights layer. And to start off with, that works. But what we see is that, at some point, without a data foundation, everything comes crashing down. So think of it like a skyscraper, right? If you want to build an iconic skyscraper, you need to spend some time building a foundation. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how much steel and cement you have. Without the foundation, it just doesn't scale. What we focus on at 5xData is how do we teach companies to build a foundation so that they can build on top of.
Yeah, and I think that another interesting element in this overall equation is the availability of a number of different hosted and managed systems for being able to do all kinds of data operations that were previously either very complex or very expensive to do in-house. And so a lot of companies, particularly startups who are early stage, out of the box, go with things like Fivetran and Snowflake and Looker for being able to get their full end-to-end visibility solution in place, but they don't necessarily have the expertise in-house to understand some of the complexity that accrues around the data ecosystem, where they'll just start pushing data into the data warehouse, and then they might do some transformations or modeling on it, but maybe not in ways that are scalable or maintainable in the long term. And then they might hit a point of complexity where they spend a lot of their time paying down the technical debt rather than being able to move forward. And I'm wondering what your experience has been in terms of working with or seeing some of the approaches that companies take who might go down this path of using these managed services and some of the incidental complexity that grows up around it.
And, I really like that you sort of mentioned Looker, Fivetran, Snowflake. Obviously, these are really, really good tools, and putting them together and working with them is, a lot of the secret sauce. I like going back to really the fundamentals, right? Like, why are we doing this? What's the goal from all of this stuff? And what we're really convinced by is that this idea that if you can answer 80% of your questions in a self-service manner, then you're far more likely to succeed. So what does that really mean, right? Like, if your intern at your company, someone who's just joined you, can answer really complicated questions. How effective was this campaign? Is the previous campaign we ran last Christmas season, what is the LTV of those users? If anyone in your company can start to answer these questions in a purely self-service manner, number one is you're giving your employees autonomy to answer questions for themselves. So, this whole idea of fail fast as a startup is built on this model that employees can answer questions, they can come up with their own hypotheses, test them, and iterate them. So, the first goal is really to give employees as much autonomy as possible. And what this really does is it frees up your data team so that they can focus on, needle moving work. I think data teams are really well positioned to be able to really find gold in your data and to focus on, what products should you be building next, or or sort of what are the interesting areas. And if your teams are really bogged down by, as you said, building models and answering questions and backlogs and all of the typical stuff which teams are spending time on right now, it doesn't quite work. So the goal has always been around autonomy for every employee in your company, as well as focus for the data team to focus on the high value stuff. And the way we see it is we break it down into, three different pillars, which we teach in this fundamental program. And, the first pillar is, automated data ingestion. So, traditionally what we find is that most companies spend a lot of their times building pipelines and managing these pipelines. Whereas, with Fivetran, what we're seeing now is really the rise of ELT. So, the first thing we focus on is moving away from ETL into ELT. And what that allows you to do is, completely automate the EL steps, which is a big advantage. The second thing we focus on is the data modeling layer. Now, a lot of your source systems have really been structured for the different applications, right? So your sort of databases are structured for your application, your sort of front-end tracking is structured in a way which makes sense for those tools. We help you, go back to what are the questions you're trying to answer, which again goes back to how are your employees going to be using this, and how do you design a data modeling layer which can answer all of those questions in a pretty robust way. So instead of having thousands or hundreds of source tables, how do you do this with a much smaller set, which becomes a lot easier to manage? And the third area is really the self-service part, right? So what are the BI tools? Again, there's no need to reinvent the wheel over here. There is a playbook which has made sense. The big companies have used it to scale to tens of thousands of employees. So, how do you set up your BI tools in a way such that anyone can answer questions? So just to recap, three pillars: ingestion, data modeling, as well as self-service. And what we're really good at doing now is, making this into a playbook, which we can teach in 12 weeks. So we help companies build this foundation from scratch in 12 weeks.
That covers one of the challenges in the space, is that because there are so many changes happening so fast, it can be difficult to keep up and to understand what choices to make, how to structure your systems, because there's the fear of missing out. And then there's also the fear of picking the wrong tool. So you're kind of torn between, I want to move fast and just get something working, but then I also want to make sure that I don't move too fast and make a mistake that's going to hamstring me, 6 months or 6 years down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Very often when companies are hiring or starting to build out a data team, they're solving for immediate problems, right? We want to get value from our data. And what they're also doing is, if you're just getting started, you're probably not going to go hire a VP of data or someone with 15 years of experience. You're going to start with someone with a few years of experience who probably understands one part of the stack, but is solving for a local maximum instead of the big picture. So we work on this idea that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. These are a certain best practices needed, and we want to make it super, super easy, almost like a no-brainer, that here's the program, this is how you do it, and you pick a project, right? So if your goal is to add visibility into your go-to-market strategy, or to find parts of your product which customers are using, great, pick that as a project. And while you implement the foundations which we teach you, you work towards that project. So at the end of 12 weeks, you've solved that problem, and now you really know how to go do this in future. So instead of selling you a fish, which is what what a lot of traditional consulting companies do, our goal is really to sort of teach you how to fish so that you can go do this yourself. And once you get to this sort of foundational layer, that's where really all the fun stuff starts to happen. That's when you can really go a lot deeper, and machine learning or more in-depth analysis start to sort of really come alive for you. But you can't really do that unless you're at a certain level of sort of maturity, which is what our goal is.
And so in working with these different companies, one question is there a particular profile of company that you're specifically looking to work with? And if so, sort of what are the characteristics? And then also in terms of the companies that you've worked with, either at 5xData or in previous roles, what do you see as being the impact on the particular industry or vertical that they're in as to the types of challenges that they're facing in being able to reach this goal of being data-driven?
So, I'll start with the first question. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really matter what industry you're in. At some point, you are going to need to have a data foundation in order to take things at the next level. We go after Series A or B companies. These companies are at a point where they have proven out they have a business, and now they've raised money to basically go scale out the business. So at this point, they start to go hire a data team, which is the perfect time to do a program like us, which just gives you the best practices and sort of sets you up for success. So a lot of the companies we work with are just getting started with data. They have a data team of under 10 people, and they're either just getting started or they have basically somewhere down the stack of the data train. We also work with a lot of companies that are traditionally not tech companies, but they could be in other industries like real estate, education, coaching has been a big one recently for us. E-commerce is another one where they want to leverage data in order to take things to the next level. So we find that, at some level, a lot of companies start to plateau. Hustle from entrepreneurs gets you from 0 to 1, but at some point it starts to plateau, and you lose visibility into what's working for your business and what's not. And without these systems, it's really difficult to give your employees clear directions and measure their success. And vague input leads to vague output. So we work with a lot of companies which have hit a plateau and now need to go take things to the next level. And this is very often their first investment in data. One of the things we've seen is that data hires are expensive, right? Especially in America, where average cost to company is $150,000. It's an expensive sport. Obviously, our programs are much cheaper than that. So a lot of our companies were the first investment in data. So I think that's the first part of the question. And the second part was around what value are these companies trying to get to, and sort of what are the obstacles they are facing. I think I did speak about both of these a little bit earlier, but number one is very often the obstacle these companies are facing is that they are making these hires. These hires start to go build out some really interesting stuff. But what happens is without these foundations, at some point everything starts to get slower. So, how many people have found themselves in situations where, easy analysis start to take longer, and decision making starts to get bottlenecked by data instead of being enabled by data, and stakeholders start losing trust in numbers because you have multiple sources of truth, and often small mistakes sort of start to enter a stack, and we enter a world where we have prioritization based on who screams the loudest. So all of these are really telltale signs that what you are building and the way you're building it is not scalable, and you really need to go invest in inside foundations. And hiring new engineers or a quick re-architecture of the stack is fixing the solution, not the fundamental problem that you haven't thought through this holistically and you haven't implemented a system which is really scalable. So this is a big problem which these companies who are trying to invest in data are facing. The other one is around those companies who just don't know any better, right? Entrepreneur build companies, they're entrepreneurs who are experts at what they did, but again, you don't know what you don't know. And at some point, if you don't know that you need to invest in this, you hit a plateau. And, we help go in there and add all this visibility, give people autonomy. And at that point, they can take things to the next level.
The first step that most of these companies need to take is actually bringing on some capacity for people who are able to actually build and manage these systems, either by bringing someone who's already internal up to speed with the technologies and with the needs of the business, or by hiring externally. And there's sort of the catch-22 there of you need someone who has expertise to be able to evaluate the potential for somebody who you're looking to fill this position, but then you need to fill this position because you don't have the expertise. And I'm curious what you see is some of the useful strategies for businesses to be able to attract talent or identify talent internally, and then how best to evaluate their potential for being able to help the organization succeed in their data projects.
We are big believers in this concept of doing data in-house. I think data is a core competitive advantage to your business. So, it's out of anything, this is one of the things that you do want to keep in-house. Obviously, working externally is great because that helps you accelerate your timelines towards projects, which makes sense. But we really push for teams investing in internal data resources. Now, this has been pretty tricky for companies just given the fact that data is relatively new, right? I think probably 9 or 10 years ago is when it started being recognized as, data engineers and data scientists started being recognized as real professions. So because of this, we're still figuring out what are some of these best practices, and what is the best way to go organize this stuff. So I think that makes hiring for data particularly challenging. Where we help is, our program really gives you a lot of the foundational stuff, right? So no need to reinvent the wheel. You sort of probably get started with someone who has experience but sort of hasn't put this together end to end. So what we say is, you're looking for, again, sort of depending on what you can hire and where you are in this journey, we're looking for like a mid-level data hire as a minimum to come do our program. So, very typically you will look for sort of a full stack data hire who can do some data engineering stuff, but also some analysis stuff. And our program will really get into the specifics of exactly what to do, what are the step by step instructions, what are the best practices, and then also access to our faculty. So as these companies are implementing them and they're stuck, so we can go in there and help them. So if you do want to start cheaper, our minimum requirements would be a junior analyst, sort of who understands some basic Python and SQL. But what we really recommend is a mid-level full stack data hire, which would give you, the best ROI in a program like ours.
Once the organization has one or multiple people on staff who are able to manage the data systems and build them out and maintain them, what are the core components or the foundational layers of the data platform that you have found to be most useful or most broadly applicable and that you recommend for these different organizations who are just starting on the journey of being data driven?
I think there's sort of two parts to it, right? Number one is, what is the infrastructure stack, and as you mentioned earlier, Looker, Fivetran, Snowflake, DBT, all of these are what I call best in class vendors. We are partnered with all of these guys. If you're on the Google Cloud, or you have a slightly different BI setup, that's fine. A lot of our stuff is built on first principles. So while they are certain tools which we recommend, they are sort of multiple ways to go do this. So a lot of the time historically has been spent on just operating, maintaining these tools and building analysis on the tools, which is shared. We find that sort of typically companies are spending 80% of the time on just the ad hoc stuff, maintenance, backlog, answering questions for the business, and 15-20%, if that, on the needle moving work. We really want to flip that around. If your data team can now spend about 20% of its time keeping these tools alive, and maintaining them, and every time a new ad hoc question comes to the business, this is an opportunity to add it onto the data modeling layer and expose it as self-service for the business. Now that more and more people can answer this, so more and more people can start to answer questions of this. And instead of your data scientists, as you get more advanced, going all the way back to the raw data, if they can focus on this model layer, which we call the business layer, everyone in the company can start to use this. It's going to make maintenance a lot easier. Instead of having these massive fan out problems and combining application logic inside your transforms, you start to build a very clean layer where both your stakeholders as well as your data team can go to start consuming data. So, we want to shift that. We want to shift the 80-20 into the 20-80, so that now the data teams can actually spend 80% of their time on going deeper into insights, on working with the product teams and figuring out what is the market research, what are our customers using, and what are some of the features which we should build next. So a lot of the data science or the analytics work, which just frankly, a lot of companies want to do, but in reality, they never end up sort of doing that. And that's where we want them to be focusing their time on.
And then on the self-serve aspect of things, what have you found to be some of the context or training that's needed for different users within the business to be able to effectively ask and answer questions of the data that they have and understand how to apply the information that they receive from that, particularly given the potential for things like conflicting concepts of how to distill a given metric or how different data sources might represent different information separately where they might have different scales or different contexts or representations of the data, and just how best to handle the modeling in the warehouse layer to ensure that the self-serve layer is actually able to be effective and not cause any confusion.
Sort of just to recap, how do you ensure success in the self-service layer, and sort of what are the tactics over there? And what we find is that self-service isn't a new concept, right? We've been using this all the time now, right? Every time you go to a kiosk at an airport and print your boarding pass, or every time you pay for your own groceries at Whole Foods, or at any of these stores, you are using self-service. What's happening is that this has become so much more complicated because the data modeling layer hasn't been set up in a way to answer business questions. It's still modeled in a way for the different applications, and it's just stitched together. So when you combine Mixpanel with your CRM, with your application databases, and just expose it inside Looker, it becomes really, really complicated to answer basic questions, because you need to have the context as an engineer on how this is all stitched together. What we focus on is, don't expose the raw data inside your BI tools. Actually work backwards and try and figure out, hey, what is 80% of the questions we're trying to answer? What does the marketing team want to answer? And what does the sales team want to do? And what does the engineering team do? And work backwards and design a model which can answer these questions. And then, what the data team focuses on is building out the transforms from the raw data into this layer. And at that point, when you expose this clean layer inside your self-service tools, it actually becomes pretty easy and intuitive to go use this. We see a lot of companies, and even Looker, for instance, talking about models like train the trainer, and have these people in every department who know how to use these dashboards, and they become the role models and pushers for using self-service. And some of that kind of makes sense, but I believe that success in the data modeling layer is a much, much better indicator of how easily self-service will be adopted than any training strategies which you can go do later.
RudderStack is the smart customer data pipeline. Easily build pipelines connecting your whole customer data stack, then make them smarter by ingesting and activating enriched data from your warehouse, enabling identity stitching and advanced use cases like lead scoring and in-app personalization. Start building a smarter customer data pipeline today. Sign up for free at dataengineeringpodcast.com/rudder. As you mentioned, specifically, not just dumping a bunch of raw data into the business intelligence tool, because then there are just too many areas for misinterpreting that. And I think that, too, working backwards from the questions that you're trying to answer is helpful, because if you're starting from the raw data and then trying to figure out how to model everything, then it can be confusing to try to figure out what are the high priority items, how can I structure this data in a way that is going to be useful, and just understanding like what are the questions that are actually already being asked and then answering those, rather than trying to design things to be what you might need rather than what you concretely need right now, is a useful way to frame the problem.
Absolutely. I think that overcomplication of your modeling layer is probably the worst thing you can do. It makes it so much harder for the business to just answer the basic stuff. Going back to WeWork, for a long time we had 3 core activity streams which helped answer majority of the questions. We had one which focused on what are all the activities someone can do before they become a member. The second one was all the activities they do after they become a member. And the third one was information on our buildings, capacity, opening up, occupancy, all of that fun stuff. And through these 3 tables, we can answer most questions, and even super complicated stuff like how effective was one marketing campaign in driving users, and how long did those users stay for once they signed up, and how many posts did they make on our internal social network within the first month, right? That is 50 different data sources. If you go back to raw data, there's probably a few thousand lines of code. we could answer that in like 50 lines or less. So it all boils down to, for most businesses, you shouldn't need to have more than 5 tables in your data modeling layer, which can answer majority of the stuff. And, obviously use these tables as the core tables, join them with some of your fact tables to get more details. But just from a raw capability standpoint of view, you can do a lot of cool stuff with activity streams. And so that's how you should be thinking about modeling your data.
Once you have these foundational layers of internal staff to be able to handle the data projects, somewhere to store the data and be able to, load source data into the data warehouse, a self-service layer for business users to be able to ask and answer their own questions. How do you go about identifying and prioritizing areas of work for data engineers in particular, but other data professionals as well, to be able to understand how to have the most impact on the business so that your time is well spent and that you're not chasing down a project that's interesting but isn't necessarily going to add any real value to the business?
That links in really well to the other part of our program. So, we offer this fundamentals training, which is a 12-week program, which helps you build foundations from scratch. Once you have these foundations, that's when it's a really cool time to be, because that's when you can really move fast and execute quickly. So, the second thing which we offer is this mastermind, which we really sort of bundle together. And are you familiar with a concept of a mastermind?
Yeah, it's definitely a useful concept. And for people who aren't familiar, it's the idea that you have a group of people who are experts in their respective fields, but not necessarily within the same field, who gather together on a periodic basis to ask questions of each other and get answers from their peer group so that they're able to teach and learn from each other and be able to accelerate their ability to execute on their vision, rather than a more mentor-oriented approach where you have somebody who is a few steps ahead of you in a given area. And so you're learning from them, but it's not as much of a reciprocal exchange.
And the only reason I asked is I wasn't familiar with the concept of masterminds when I lived in America. I just hadn't heard of them. And I've been in Bali, which is another story. But when COVID hit, at that time I was living in Shanghai. I came to Bali and I got stuck over here very quickly. China got locked down, so I was a COVID. So I was stuck in Bali, which is there are a lot worse places to get stuck in. But what I did is I joined this mastermind, and in 2020, that was the best decision that I made. It just accelerated my professional as well as my personal lives. And this mastermind wasn't even focused on, it had nothing to do with data. It was just a general purpose mastermind. Sort of so much so that I really started paying attention to masterminds, what they are, and how they're used. And it turns out that this is not a new concept. This has been done for the last 75 years. Now, most famously, Tony Robbins runs one. He charges $500,000 for access to his, and he's got Fortune 50 CEOs in there. But masterminds, amazing tools at being able to accelerate your timelines towards your business goals or your personal goals. And as you said, it's this idea when you bring in a diverse group of people. Our mastermind, it's a business data mastermind. So, we bring in data leaders, data engineers, data scientists into a potent container with the idea that if we bring in the right people, now the group collective is way smarter, way more balanced, and super beneficial to everyone inside the mastermind. And going back to your question of, at a strategic level, now that you have the fundamentals, what do you focus on? How do you prioritize? This is where the mastermind really helps. This idea that being surrounded with this peer group, which is super diverse and well balanced, it allows you to strategize, brainstorm, find new perspectives, very often learn what not to do. If you want to get to a certain level, this is what worked for us, this is what didn't work for us. And that's really where the medicine lies. So our fundamentals program combined with this mastermind is super potent in once these companies have these foundations, it's then sort of what do they focus on, what do they prioritize, what to do, what not to do. And that is just, the sort of fastest way of hitting your business goals and of being able to accelerate even your personal life. Like what I found is that these people in my mastermind are now just, very, very dear friends of mine. A lot of us started to work together. So it's really helped 5x data. What I find really interesting is, especially in New York and San Francisco and some of the biggest cities in America, community is often a word which is thrown around a lot. And we call ourselves a community company, and we acquired meetups, so have a lot of context around there. The two areas of sort of community and these meetups and open source, which I feel could be more potent, which masterminds really do well at, is number one is this area of consistency, right? In a mastermind group, in our group, you're meeting weekly for a period of 12 weeks. Anything you do consistently is when you start to see exponential results. And that's something which a lot of communities and meetups don't do a very good job in. And the second area is accountability, which is a huge, huge piece in any sort of personal or professional development, which is again lacking inside our traditional sort of definitions of community, which masterminds do a really good job in. So, the consistency and accountability combined with the brainstorming and new perspectives and this peer group, which you're introduced in, is just, an ultra potent combination and really takes things to the next level. So I think we are probably the first company which has focused on a mastermind which is purely focused on the data space. And just for our customers so far and just what we're seeing in the market, this is something people are super, super, super excited about. So we are going to be doing a lot more of that along with our fundamental programs.
It's definitely an interesting approach. And in a lot of ways, this podcast has become my own sort of personal mastermind group where every week I get to speak with professionals and leaders in the industry who are, building the tools that I'm using or who have been using different combinations of technologies that I can learn from to be able to understand how best to apply it to my own work. And so I can definitely see the value that is available for just being able to ask a question of somebody and be able to get immediate feedback rather than having to resort to some of these sort of longer cycles of asking questions on Stack Overflow or hunting down the Slack group for something and then hoping that somebody with enough context can respond to answer your question in a satisfactory manner.
I think that makes a lot of sense, right? And what really comes alive for me over here is as you get immersed in these conversations, many of them might not be directly relevant to you at this point, right? Like a lot of this stuff could be, a few people talking about concepts which you might not be at a point which are super relevant. But listening into these conversations and listening into different people's perspectives really strengthens your overall understanding of a topic. So when these conversations do become relevant, or when you start getting into pros and cons and really the more tactical stuff of there are 100 different ways to go do this, how should we approach it? That's when this overall understanding of topics and these new perspectives sort of really shine. And I bet just with your experience and all these amazing people, data scientists and engineers and leaders that you have been speaking with, you're probably a very, very good person to go to if someone wants to get started with data. And I think a lot of your success sort of comes from this fact that you now probably have, number one, obviously an extremely potent network, but also to so much contextual knowledge of what are the problems out there and what are the pros and cons of these different approaches in solving these problems, which allows you to pick the best tools for the problem in the moment.
Yeah, it's definitely been a great experience and one that I definitely wouldn't have anywhere near the amount of understanding of what tools to apply when if it was just acquired through trial and error and working on the projects that come up in my day-to-day because I've got an exposure to a much broader range of problem domains than I would in any single occupation or job role unless I was maybe switching jobs every day of the week and cycling back to a few of them periodically.
Yeah, for sure. I 100% agree. That makes sense.
For any companies that you're working with who are maybe further along in the journey of building out data capacity and they have hit the point where they're stalling and they're not able to make meaningful forward progress because they're spending so much time trying to pay down technical debt from decisions they've made early on, what are some of the common mistakes that you see them having made that are avoidable for other businesses who are starting out, or some of the lessons that you've learned from those organizations that have hit that wall that you've applied to the way that you've structured your lessons in 5xData?
So I think with companies that have already some traction or a lot of traction, they already have data teams and they're answering questions and all of this fun stuff. What we find is that they are probably doing by trial and error. That's how most people learn. Like, to be very honest, that's how I learned on what to do, what not to do. Very often it's what not to do. And what 5x Data's program is really based on is, my experience in the last 10 years trying to get this right. So, very often if companies have already sort of got started on this journey and they already have maybe BI tools and ingestion and doing things in a certain way, it's still super valuable to go do a program like ours for a few reasons, right? Number one is we're structured very roughly into 12 modules, and each of those modules focus on a core competency. So even if you're doing BI really well and you have your hand on ingestion, optimizing any of these areas, even if two or three of these modules are relevant to you, then improving your efficiency by 15-20% is extremely valuable, right? You have a data team of 10 people. Improving your efficiency by 15% is an extra hire and a half. That's super, super valuable. And especially when you sort of start to think about what does the average cost of a data hire cost, $150,000 versus the cost of a program like us, which is $15,000. Even if you get 10-15% efficiencies from doing something like this, and you learn about how to model your data, or you learn about some of the successful models where you learn about some of the successful data models which other companies have used, and you implement one of those to structure your data. Again, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Then a lot of value which just comes from optimizing a few things. And what we see is that even with teams which are super advanced, the industry is changing so quickly, and tools which were relevant 2 years ago very quickly become irrelevant. So I spend a lot of my time constantly in conversation with senior data leaders or data engineers or data scientists, figuring out, hey, what's working at this company? What are some of the pros of this approach? And with these pros, what are some of the cons? Just to make sure that we are a step ahead of what's happening out there, and we can change our programs to better reflect the current state of the industry. And I think the fundamentals training and the mastermind are really the first few steps in the puzzle. What we would love to get deeper in is the next layer of programs. Building data teams is something I'm super passionate about, especially with my experience at WeWork. How do you organize data teams? What part of the business should they report in? How do they work with software engineers? How do they work with stakeholders who are consumers of data? That's a whole program which we're super excited about building. And then other programs like, how do you build data products? All these companies are starting to collect some really, really cool information, but how do you take this information and then go build products around it with this concept of respecting privacy, which is where we're heading to. So this concept of privacy by design, but still being able to leverage data to go build data products that your customers love and absolutely adore. So these are, other programs which we'll start getting into later on this year, which will become the natural follow-ups to our fundamental and mastermind programs.
And as you have started down this journey of building out the business and the team at 5xData and starting to work with companies to help them level up their internal data capacity, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in that process?
What we've learned with companies across a few industries, it's actually kind of a sort of beautiful insight, is ultimately every company wants to leverage data. Every company has seen the value in it. I think data is the new oil, which is a famous article The Economist wrote a few years ago. is something people really relate to. And everyone wants to be leveraging data to take things to the next level. So what we've seen, which is really beautiful, is that companies want to do this, and very often they have no idea how to go do this. So it doesn't really matter what industry they're in. What's been really cool to see is a lot of companies go want to do this. What's been challenging is this is really complicated stuff. Am I doing it right? Like, how should I do this? Or we don't have the resources to go do this. And a lot of that has been true, right? Like, data hires are expensive, and getting it right is not as trivial as it seems. Just like in marketing, it's no longer enough to go have a few posts on Instagram to do marketing. There's a whole iceberg of things which happen underneath the surface. The same thing really applies in data. So I think the challenging thing is really the mindset. We love what you say you're going to do. Are we actually going to be able to get there? We're less technical than you think we are. I think that's been the biggest obstacle so far. It just allows us to focus on our program and making it accessible for as many people as possible. Our goal this year is to help 500 companies, either through our mastermind or our foundations. So we've been built in a way where my purpose and the purpose of 5xData is to be able to serve as many companies as possible. And I'm a big believer that we're living right now in this golden opportunity where if you leverage data correctly, you can use it for exponential growth. And I believe that at some point in the next, I'm not sure if it's 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, more companies with advancements in the tools and the ecosystem, is that companies will start to get more and more insights for free and more analytics. So it's going to start to level the playing field. But right now, there exists this sort of golden opportunity, which if you do this, then you can leverage data as a competitive advantage and you can grow faster. So, our purpose is to help 500 companies this year. Being on shows like this really allows us to talk about, we've built this program to make this as consumable and as simple as possible. And if you're on the fence about investing in data and you have no idea how to go do it, then we can help educate you around that mindset and then give you all the resources you need to go make it happen.
As you continue to work with these businesses and try to stay up to date with what's happening in the industry, what are some of the particular trends or specific technologies or groupings of technologies that you're keeping a close watch on for your own uses or for being able to leverage in these programs that you're offering to businesses?
The biggest, I keep going back to this, I think what was, in my opinion, the biggest thing which happened to data was this concept of warehouses, right? And sort of what Snowflake did recently, where, the idea of being able to separate out storage from compute, and with storage becoming so cheap, the idea that you can put in a lot of data inside your storage layers, and you can run compute jobs separately. And for those of you who are not familiar with Snowflake, I think why they found so much success is, instead of having dedicated hardware with tools like Redshift, Vertigo, all of these other data warehouses had, what sort of Redshift allows you to do is spin up resources on the fly, which makes it really, really affordable to then use a warehouse and sort of leverage data. And then the BI tools are a layer on top of that. So I think with Snowflake now IPOing and sort of getting all this sort of traction that it has got, it's going to make the data warehouse architecture layer even more appealing. So there's going to be a lot of advancements around the layer on top of that, which is your BI, which is analytical tools, data sciencey stuff on top of this. And that's an area which we're sort of very closely following. I think Looker does a really good job on data discovery and reporting. We're super interested, and I'm personally sort of looking out for stuff around data modeling and around really sort of surfacing these insights back into the business and making that process a lot easier.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
There's a lot of great tooling out there. Obviously, there is room for improving what we have in all areas of it: ingestion, modeling, analytics, machine learning, all of this stuff. But at this point, there's no need to go reinvent the wheel, right? A lot of the tools which exist out there are do an extremely good job at it. We really help stitch all of that together to make it as easy and as consumable as possible. So, I think the one thing I would focus on really is there's no need to reinvent the wheel over here. Sort of continue using. There are some tools which work really, really well together, and sort of focusing on that is much better ROI than sort of trying to optimize for a few things these tools might not be doing as well.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing with 5xData. It's definitely a useful pursuit to help more businesses understand how to implement their data stacks and the technical talent that they need to be able to be successful and become data-driven and improve their efficiency and their ability to serve their customers. So thank you for all the time and energy you're putting into that, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to helping our businesses and entrepreneurs really take things to the next level with data.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.